So for you to do now, you should be drawing an arrow to show which direction the water seems to be flowing. And then you're writing down what you notice about the sizes of the streams at the top of the mountain and then compared to near the base. So today we are talking about watersheds. So a watershed, that's what's going on this first slide, is watershed. So a watershed is basically everything you see in that diagram there. So in a watershed, any precipitation, remember precipitation can be snow, rain, sleet, hail, etc. It's anything that falls from the sky that is liquid, or water at least. The way that you can think about this is that any precipitation that falls in this boundary and flows to the same destination, or anything that flows together. So eventually, it all reaches the same point. So on your slide, I'd like you to highlight. I use red just to definitely show. I would like you to trace the same line I'm tracing here on this ridge up to the top of the mountains, and then to the edge of this boundary you see here. Everything in that boundary flows to the same point. So that entire boundary is the watershed. So if you have rainfall in any parts of your watershed, they will all flow downhill and go to the same place. So this second part of the watershed, the part we're looking at is on that red arrow. These parts of the water system, of the watershed, are called the headwaters. So those are called the headwaters. The headwaters are the ultimate source of the river. So on the screen, you can see the little red arrow. That little red arrow those are the headwaters. Those streams up at the top there. Our next part of the of the watershed, I keep trying to say water system. It's not a thing. Of the watershed. The next part of the watershed is called the main stem. And the main stem, I like that most of the words when it comes to rivers, most of the words are really self-explanatory. So headwaters, where the water, like the top of the body is your head, right? So the top of the watershed are the headwaters. Like it makes sense. The main stem is the main channel. Oops, why won't you write? Main channel. Okay, and so that main channel is really the largest chunk of the stream. That is where everything eventually flows to when you have these smaller water systems flowing in. And we're going to discuss what the smaller water systems are in the next slide. This word for this slide you guys may have heard of before. So these smaller rivers you can see with all the little red arrows, all those small rivers, those are called tributaries. And tributaries are small rivers or small streams that flow into a larger river or stream. And they eventually, all of those streams, they add up. All of those itty bitty little creeks and cricks and streams and little rivers, all of them eventually flow into the larger river, which add water to the main stem. So in the United States, we have the largest river system in the United States is the Mississippi River. So if you guys know, this is where I told you guys before that I grew up in Colorado. So all along this area, along the Colorado Drainage Basin, I'm stealing this from Miss Pancake, who drew all these cute little mountains last time. So that mountain system is called the Rocky Mountain Range. Super original name, just called the Rockies, just like the Colorado Rockies. That's where they get the name from. So this line, I want you to highlight it yellow, because I highlight it yellow. And I want you to highlight that line. That line is called a continental divide. And like I said, the watershed unit is great because all of the words are so self-explanatory. Continental divide. It divides the continent. What does it divide it to? Into different drainage basins. So you have the Mississippi drainage basin. So if you look at all of those rivers, the Yellowstone, Cheyenne, Platte, Kansas, Arkansas, Ohio, Tennessee, Illinois, Des Moines, Iowa, and the Red River, they all flow into the Mississippi River and drain out in Louisiana. The Colorado drainage basin, you have the Green River, the Colorado River, and the Gila River, and they all flow out somewhere it looks like in either California, bottom of California, or Arizona, I think. So the reason why I highlighted this line yellow is because having been from Colorado and grown up there, it is a very well-known phenomena of people and cultural activity that people will go stand on the Continental Divide, they'll drive there, buy the signs, and then they'll pee, and they'll take pictures of it. The reason being is because that divide is the highest point in between two rivers, two systems. So any water that's going on either side of that line, the water that's on the west side of the line will flow towards the Colorado River, and the water that's on, any liquid that's on the right side of the Mississippi drainage basin will flow to the Mississippi River. So people are dumb, but they're kind of entertaining sometimes too. So on this slide, what I would like you to do is I want you to describe how do people move and behave at each stage of life. So how do they move and behave when they're young? How do they move and behave when they are mature? And then how do they behave when they're old? You guys can just abbreviate it, the YMO, if you don't want to write out the whole word, young, mature, and old. So we are going to talk about our young or our youthful stage of development for streams. So young streams, just like you guys said, these are going to be pretty self-explanatory. Our young streams are fast, they are small. So these are the streams, the young ones that start up at the headwaters. They're young, they're small, meaning that they're more narrow. Their gradients are steep, so they have a very steep gradient. And then these rivers, because remember when I told you a few months ago, probably just last week, gravity is pulling water down to be at the bottom of the ocean. That is where water ultimately wants to end up. And that's where all sediments want to end up eventually, is at the bottom of the ocean. So when the water is high on a mountaintop, that water is going to be, and especially with the slope, water is going to want to go straight down. So if this were a landscape, I'm going to make something we call a cross section from A to B. If we take a slice through the river, if this used to be the water's surface, as soon as water is on the surface on a mountain or near the headwaters, water wants to go straight down. So the fact that water wants to go straight down and get to the lowest elevation possible as quickly as possible means that those headwaters are ultimately going to make a V shape because they're going to erode the bedrock rather than eroding the sides or rather than transporting. They want to erode the bedrock. They're also going to move larger sized sediments like boulders and cobbles. And those boulders and cobbles are going to bang into each other, break down rock even more. And what this is ultimately going to form is called a V-shaped valley. So that's like the typical valley you guys think of. You think mountains have valleys. In this case, V-shaped valleys are going to be formed by our rivers. So make sure you guys write that down. That is your landscape feature. Thank you, Emily. That's a very nice drawing. Thank you for imitating my drawing. You have very good notes. So remember, V-shaped valley is going to have that nice V shape. Make sure you write out the word completely, because if you just say a landscape has a V, like that doesn't, like you're not going to remember that. when it comes time for the regions. So our next cycle of the stream, just like people, supposedly people become mature. I don't know about that. But this next stage of the stream is the mature stage of the stream. So this one again, yeah, you guys are already on this. Whose is this? This is Iman's. Thank you. Iman is doing my notes for me, apparently. Thank you, Iman. Already highlighted them for me. So just like Iman highlighted, the velocity of these streams are medium. They are like medium width. They're pretty gentle slope. And then I bet you can bet what comes next. They actually, because they're still strong, but once they reach the bottom of this mountain, they have a lot of sediment that they're bearing. So notice as it goes down and it hits the open land, it slows down a little bit and it curves. And what it does is it forms something called a meander. And that's going to be our landscape feature. Our landscape features are meandering streams. And so meandering streams, meander really sounds like the verb, to meander. So meandering, like it sounds like a very Midwest word. So if you think of people from the Midwest, they move a little bit slower and they kind of wander around a little bit as compared to New Yorkers who just go, try to get in anywhere as close as they can, as fast as they can. Meandering streams tend to move side to side. So once it reaches the bottom of the mountain, it slows down, or it may encounter some bedrock that is not as easily eroded, and it's going to curve. And so when it curves, that sediment is actually going to erode the sides rather than the bed. So this means that the rivers are less steep, and actually the riverbeds are more, if we were to take a slice through this river, I'm just going to take a slice through the middle of the river there. This little slice through the river, if we were to trace what the bottom looks like, the bottom of this river in that place might be a little more round. Might be slightly steeper on the sides, might have a little bit more of a rounded bottom. So our last stage, you guys are flying through this already. You guys are funny. Wow, a ton of you responded before I could. Where am I? There we go. So this last stage of the river life cycle is just like you guys are already anticipating. The velocity is slow. It's very widespread. The gradient's pretty flat once it reaches the bottom of the hill, so it gets to slow down. And some of you are already guessing this, at this stage, it mostly does, in fact, transport. So the reason it transports is because as the sediments have been going through this river, as they get farther away from their source, so most sediments, their ultimate source is from mountains or high elevations. Gravity always wants to pull things down, and it wants to ultimately erode. So what happens is that most of that sediment, by the time that it's in the old stage of a river, most of that sediment is small. Most of it is sand, silt, and clay. And because it's not moving very fast, it can't really pick up those large sediments anymore. So what ends up happening is they kind of just end up getting shuffled side to side. So this diagram on the picture is not good for it, but if we were to take a slice of the river at this point, this is what we would see. A to B. So what we would see on our river here is we would see very shallow streams. And there would be many of them. And so a landscape feature that you get here, you actually get two landscape features. One landscape feature is a braided stream. And you also get floodplains. And just like it sounds like, they are plains that flood. And so when you get a lot of discharge, which we'll talk about that tomorrow, when you get a high amount of water influx, so let's say that you have a huge rainstorm event, or oftentimes in places like Louisiana, you get hurricanes, which cause the river levels to rise. When they rise, they will pick up those sediments, and they might be able to pick up more sediments. And so those rivers will overtop their banks, and they'll actually spread out to the edges. Then when the water starts to recede again, it will actually drop off lots of sediments on the bank. Those sediments that are dropped off on the bank are oftentimes things like clays and smaller minerals. That is actually what makes the floodplains so fertile, is because those sediments and those particles are smaller and more easily accessible for plants to take in nutrients, which is why people tend to settle on floodplains. They're also flat, and so they're easier to build on. But those floodplains are often flooded, so they're kind of sometimes a dangerous place to live. Okay, so your last slide of the day is this exit ticket. Which of these do you relate to the most? Do you relate to the young part of the stream life cycle, the mature, or the old, or somewhere in between? And that is all that I have for you all.